Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that a single valve operator working for a Canadian company in a remote facility near the Arctic Circle possesses more power over American survival than the President of the United States during winter months? And what if I told you that this individual, whose name appears on no government documents and who answers to no American authority, can condemn 50 million Americans to freezing temperatures and economic collapse with the turn of a single valve wheel? Most people believe that natural gas supply is managed by market forces and distributed through systems controlled by domestic energy companies operating under government oversight. They assume that American heating and electricity generation depend on American resources or reliable imports from stable trading partners. They do not recognize what I recognize: the complete subordination of American winter survival to Canadian pipeline control, executed through a delivery system so centralized that a single Canadian decision can determine whether American families live or die during the coldest months of the year. This is not energy policy. This is the weaponization of basic survival needs, placing American urban civilization at the mercy of foreign operators who control the valves that determine whether American cities have heat, electricity, and the natural gas supply necessary for basic winter survival. The Trans-Canada Pipeline System represents one of the most extensive and strategically critical energy transportation networks ever constructed, spanning thousands of kilometers from production fields in Western Canada through the industrial heartland of the United States to distribution centers that supply major metropolitan areas throughout the American Northeast and Midwest. This integrated pipeline network carries approximately 3.6 billion cubic meters of natural gas daily during peak winter demand periods, making it one of the largest energy transportation systems in the world and the foundation of American winter energy security. But the scale of gas transportation reveals only part of the strategic equation. The critical factor is the complete dependence of American urban centers on uninterrupted flow through this Canadian-controlled pipeline system during months when natural gas interruptions would cause immediate humanitarian disasters and economic collapse across regions containing tens of millions of people. The mathematical reality of American natural gas dependency becomes apparent when examining winter consumption patterns and the sources of supply that keep American homes heated and American power plants operating during months when energy demand reaches critical levels. During typical winter months, American natural gas consumption increases by 60 to 80% above summer baseline levels as heating systems throughout northern states operate continuously to maintain habitable indoor temperatures. The American Northeast, encompassing states from Maine to Pennsylvania and including major metropolitan areas like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, imports approximately 40% of its winter natural gas supply from Canadian sources through the Trans-Canada Pipeline System. During extreme weather events such as polar vortex conditions or extended cold snaps, Canadian imports can represent 50 to 60% of total regional natural gas supply, as American domestic production proves insufficient to meet peak demand. Chicago, the third largest city in the United States and a major industrial center, receives approximately 30% of its natural gas supply from Canadian sources during winter months. Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, and dozens of other cities throughout the Great Lakes region depend on Canadian pipeline deliveries for 25-40% of their winter heating fuel, creating vulnerabilities that could affect millions of people if Canadian gas flows were interrupted or reduced. The pipeline infrastructure that carries this essential Canadian gas operates through a series of major transmission lines that cross the international border at multiple points and connect to distribution networks serving residential, commercial, and industrial customers throughout the American Midwest and Northeast. The most critical components of this system include the Trans-Canada Mainline, the Great Lakes Transmission System, and connecting pipelines that form an integrated network capable of delivering massive volumes of gas across vast distances. The individuals who control the flow of natural gas through this pipeline network are not American government officials or American energy company executives operating under American regulatory oversight. They are Canadian pipeline operators working for companies like TC Energy, Enbridge, and other Canadian corporations that operate according to Canadian policy priorities, Canadian safety regulations, and Canadian strategic interests that may conflict with American energy security needs. Canadian pipeline control room operators monitor sophisticated systems that provide real-time information about gas flow rates, pipeline pressure, compression station operations, and demand patterns throughout the integrated North American natural gas network. From their monitoring stations in Calgary, Toronto, and other Canadian facilities, these operators can observe natural gas consumption in American cities, track heating demand at major American institutions, and identify system vulnerabilities that could be exploited to maximize the impact of any decision to reduce or restrict gas deliveries to American markets. The senior pipeline dispatcher at TC Energy's Operations Center possesses the technical authority and operational capability to reduce or shut off natural gas flows to major American metropolitan areas within hours of receiving instructions from Canadian company management or Canadian government officials. This individual can affect American natural gas supply more directly and more immediately than most American government officials, American utility managers, or American emergency response coordinators. The decision-making process for pipeline flow restrictions operates entirely within Canadian corporate and regulatory frameworks. There are no American approval requirements, no mandatory consultation procedures with American authorities, and no advanced notification systems that would provide American officials with adequate warning of impending natural gas supply disruptions that could affect millions of people. Canadian pipeline operators can implement flow restrictions for reasons ranging from routine maintenance operations to pipeline safety concerns to commercial disputes with American customers to broader policy conflicts between Canadian and American governments. American officials may not learn of these decisions until natural gas pressure drops throughout distribution systems serving major cities, by which point emergency response procedures may be inadequate to prevent humanitarian disasters. The vulnerability of American natural gas consumers to Canadian pipeline decisions became dramatically apparent during the February 2021 winter storm that affected Texas and demonstrated how quickly modern energy systems can collapse when supply sources are interrupted. During that crisis, natural gas production and pipeline operations throughout the south-central United States were disrupted by extreme weather conditions, leaving millions of people without heat or electricity during life-threatening cold temperatures. The Texas crisis resulted in over 700 deaths and billions of dollars in economic losses, providing a preview of what would occur if Canadian natural gas supplies to the American Northeast and Midwest were suddenly interrupted during similar winter weather conditions. The difference is that Canadian pipeline disruptions would affect much larger populations across multiple states and could be implemented deliberately rather than resulting from weather-related equipment failures. During peak winter conditions, when outdoor temperatures drop below 20 degrees Celsius for extended periods, natural gas demand in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Boston can increase to levels that approach the maximum capacity of available pipeline systems. Under these conditions, even small reductions in Canadian gas supplies could trigger supply shortages that would force utilities to implement emergency rationing procedures and potentially leave residential customers without adequate heating fuel. The cascading effects of natural gas supply disruptions extend far beyond residential heating to encompass electrical power generation, industrial operations, and commercial facilities that depend on natural gas for basic operations. Approximately 40% of American electricity generation depends on natural gas-fired power plants, many of which are located in regions that receive substantial portions of their gas supply from Canadian pipeline systems. Natural gas power plants cannot operate without adequate fuel supply, and most facilities maintain only limited on-site gas storage that would be exhausted within hours if pipeline deliveries were interrupted. During winter months, when electrical demand is high due to heating requirements, the loss of gas-fired electrical generation could create rolling blackouts and power supply emergencies that would compound the humanitarian impact of heating fuel shortages. The economic implications of Canadian natural gas leverage extend throughout American industrial operations and commercial activities that depend on reliable energy supplies for production processes, facility heating, and operational continuity. Manufacturing facilities throughout the Midwest and Northeast that use natural gas for production processes would be forced to reduce operations or shut down entirely if Canadian pipeline supplies were restricted. The steel industry, chemical manufacturing, food processing, and dozens of other industrial sectors that are concentrated in regions served by Canadian pipeline systems would face immediate operational difficulties and potential facility closures that could affect hundreds of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in economic activity. The strategic implications of American dependence on Canadian natural gas supplies become most apparent during winter months, when pipeline disruptions would create immediate threats to public safety and social stability. Unlike electrical power outages, which can be survived for several days using emergency procedures and backup systems, natural gas supply interruptions during winter conditions can become life-threatening within hours for vulnerable populations, including elderly residents, families with young children, and people with medical conditions that require heated indoor environments. American emergency management systems and disaster response procedures are not designed to handle natural gas supply emergencies, affecting tens of millions of people across multiple states simultaneously. Emergency shelters, temporary housing facilities, and medical support systems would be overwhelmed by the scale of population displacement and humanitarian needs that would result from widespread heating fuel shortages during severe winter conditions. The psychological impact of Canadian natural gas leverage on American policymakers has been profound but remains largely unacknowledged in public discussions of American energy security. Officials who understand the extent of American dependence on Canadian pipeline systems find themselves managing domestic policies and international relationships with constant awareness that Canadian decisions about natural gas exports could trigger humanitarian emergencies that would overwhelm government response capabilities. The Department of Energy, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and other agencies responsible for energy security and emergency preparedness have conducted classified assessments of American vulnerability to Canadian natural gas supply disruptions. These assessments reportedly conclude that prolonged pipeline interruptions during winter months could cause civilian casualties and social disorder on a scale that would exceed the government's ability to provide adequate emergency response. State and local government officials in regions that depend on Canadian natural gas have begun developing emergency procedures for natural gas supply disruptions. But these plans are constrained by the limited alternative energy sources and emergency shelter capacity that would be available during winter emergencies, affecting millions of people simultaneously. The political implications of Canadian natural gas control have become apparent as American officials recognize that Canadian pipeline decisions can affect American domestic politics and policy priorities more directly than traditional diplomatic pressure or economic sanctions. During periods of tension between Canadian and American governments, Canadian officials possess the ability to create immediate pressure on American political leaders by threatening or implementing natural gas supply restrictions that would affect millions of American voters. The effectiveness of this leverage was demonstrated during the 2021 Keystone XL pipeline dispute, when Canadian officials suggested that American opposition to Canadian pipeline projects could affect Canadian willingness to maintain reliable natural gas exports to American markets. American officials found themselves forced to consider the humanitarian and political consequences of Canadian natural gas restrictions when evaluating policies that might conflict with Canadian energy industry interests. Canadian pipeline companies have established extensive lobbying operations in Washington and state capitals throughout regions that depend on Canadian natural gas supplies. These lobbying efforts focus not only on energy policies, but on broader trade, environmental, and regulatory issues that could affect Canadian pipeline operations or Canadian energy company profitability. The most sophisticated aspect of Canadian natural gas leverage involves the integration of pipeline operations with broader Canadian strategic objectives and policy priorities. Canadian natural gas exports are coordinated with Canadian positions on trade negotiations, environmental regulations, climate policies, and diplomatic relationships in ways that maximize Canadian bargaining power while minimizing the appearance of direct economic coercion. During trade negotiations between the United States and Canada, Canadian natural gas pricing and export policies are adjusted to create economic pressure on American negotiating positions without violating formal trade agreements or creating grounds for dispute resolution procedures. American regions that depend on Canadian natural gas experience price increases and supply uncertainties that create political pressure for accommodation of Canadian negotiating positions. The timing of pipeline maintenance operations, supply contract renegotiations, and regulatory reviews is coordinated to coincide with American political decision-making processes in ways that maximize Canadian influence over American policy choices. American officials find themselves managing domestic political pressures created by Canadian natural gas policies while negotiating with Canadian counterparts who control the energy supplies that affect those political pressures. The technological sophistication of modern pipeline control systems creates additional vulnerabilities that extend beyond simple decisions to reduce or eliminate natural gas exports. Canadian pipeline operators possess detailed real-time information about American natural gas consumption patterns, storage levels, alternative supply availability, and emergency response capabilities that could be used to maximize the impact of supply restrictions. Canadian operators understand American natural gas infrastructure better than most American officials because they must coordinate their operations with American distribution systems to maintain reliable gas deliveries. This technical knowledge provides Canadian operators with insights into American system vulnerabilities that could be exploited for maximum humanitarian and economic impact during any crisis or dispute. The automated systems that control natural gas flow through Trans-Canada pipeline networks can respond within minutes to operator commands, allowing Canadian control room personnel to implement flow restrictions or pressure reductions that would affect American natural gas supplies faster than American emergency response systems could react to prevent shortages. The legal and regulatory framework governing Canadian natural gas exports provides extensive discretion for Canadian authorities to restrict gas supplies for reasons ranging from pipeline safety concerns to environmental compliance requirements to national security considerations. Canadian officials are not required to obtain American approval or provide advance warning before implementing export restrictions that could affect American energy security. The contract terms that govern natural gas sales from Canadian producers to American customers include force majeure provisions and other clauses that allow Canadian suppliers to reduce or suspend deliveries during emergencies, maintenance operations, or regulatory compliance activities. These contractual provisions are written according to Canadian law and interpreted by Canadian regulatory authorities, giving Canadian companies substantial flexibility to restrict American gas supplies when Canadian interests require such actions. The integration of Canadian natural gas supplies into American energy infrastructure has created dependencies that operate automatically and continuously, rather than only during specific crisis periods. American heating systems, power plants, and industrial facilities are designed and operated on the assumption of reliable Canadian natural gas deliveries, making these systems vulnerable to Canadian policy decisions, even when those decisions are not explicitly intended to pressure American interests. The mathematical reality of winter natural gas demand makes American vulnerability to Canadian pipeline control most acute during the months when energy supply interruptions would cause maximum humanitarian impact and social disruption. During January and February, when outdoor temperatures throughout northern states regularly drop below 10 degrees Celsius, natural gas consumption for heating purposes can represent 60 to 70% of total American natural gas usage. Under these extreme demand conditions, Canadian natural gas imports become essential for preventing supply shortages that would leave American families without adequate heating fuel during life-threatening weather conditions. American domestic natural gas production, storage capacity, and alternative supply sources are insufficient to replace Canadian imports during at peak winter demand periods without creating shortages that would affect millions of people. The seasonal concentration of American vulnerability to Canadian natural gas control creates opportunities for economic and political coercion that are most effective precisely when American populations are most dependent on energy supplies for basic survival. Canadian officials who choose to restrict natural gas exports during winter months can create humanitarian pressure on American political leaders that would be impossible to achieve through other forms of economic or diplomatic pressure. The historical precedent for energy-based coercion demonstrates how effectively resource control can be used to achieve political objectives that traditional diplomatic or military pressure cannot accomplish. During the 1973 oil embargo, Middle Eastern countries demonstrated that energy supply restrictions could force major policy changes in developed countries that were otherwise resistant to external pressure. Canadian natural gas leverage operates through similar principles, but with greater immediate impact. Because natural gas supply interruptions during winter conditions can become life-threatening within hours, rather than creating gradual economic pressure over weeks or months. The humanitarian consequences of Canadian natural gas restrictions would create political pressure on American officials that would be impossible to ignore or deflect through alternative policy measures. The precedent established by Canadian willingness to use energy leverage for political objectives suggests that future disputes between American and Canadian governments could escalate into energy supply crises that affect tens of millions of American civilians. The pipeline infrastructure that was designed to facilitate energy trade between friendly neighbors has become a weapon system that gives Canadian officials life and death authority over American urban populations during winter months. The transformation of natural gas pipelines from commercial infrastructure into instruments of political control represents one of the most significant but least recognized changes in North American strategic relationships since World War II. The Canadian pipeline operator who controls natural gas flows to major American cities possesses more immediate power over American domestic conditions than most American government officials. The age of American energy independence remains a political slogan rather than operational reality. American natural gas imports from Canada have increased every year for the past decade, creating deeper dependencies and greater vulnerabilities that Canadian officials have demonstrated their willingness to exploit for strategic advantage. Most Americans remain unaware that their winter survival depends on the cooperation of foreign pipeline operators who answer to Canadian rather than American authorities. They continue to assume that American energy security is managed by American institutions operating according to American priorities, not recognizing that Canadian officials can freeze American cities by turning valves located hundreds of kilometers north of the border. The mathematical certainty of American vulnerability cannot be disputed through political rhetoric or policy statements. 50 million Americans need Canadian natural gas to survive winter conditions. Canadian pipeline operators can eliminate that gas supply within hours of receiving instructions to do so. American backup systems and alternative suppliers cannot immediately replace the volume of Canadian natural gas that American cities consume during peak winter demand. This dependency represents the most direct form of foreign control over American civilian populations that has existed since the founding of the Republic. It operates through technical systems that appear commercial and regulatory frameworks that seem routine, but it provides Canadian officials with the power to determine whether American families have heat during the coldest months of the year. The Canadian valve operator in the remote pipeline facility may never choose to freeze American cities, but the mere fact that this power exists fundamentally alters the relationship between the two countries. America negotiates with Canada not as an equal partner, but as a dependent nation, whose citizens can be subjected to life-threatening conditions at Canadian discretion. This is how modern dependencies create modern vulnerabilities. The pipeline that was built to supply American energy needs has become the mechanism through which Canada controls American survival. The valve that regulates gas flow has become the switch that determines whether Americans live or die during winter. Most people still do not understand what this means, but their survival depends entirely on Canadian decisions about whether to keep that valve open.